My name is Torraine Walker, and welcome to episode 2 of the Black Male Study Session. This is a weekly series of discussions and roundtables focused on addressing the issues affecting Black men and boys. This series is sponsored by the African Americans Men Historical Society. The AMHIS is a Black American men's intellectual society focused on the preservation, history, and empowerment of Black men. To learn more, go to amhis.org and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. So let's get into it. The subject for this conversation is intersectional failure. In 1989, legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality to define how race, gender, sexual identity, and physical appearance and other factors impact where individuals and groups land on the scale of being privileged or oppressed. In 1990, academic Patricia Hill Collins introduced the theory of the matrix of domination in her book, Black Feminist Thought. The matrix of domination posits that people can experience oppression or be oppressors, or experience privilege or be disprivileged in a variety of ways depending on their classifications. That's the definition of intersectionality. Intersectionality as practiced by nonprofits, activist groups, and fundraisers leaves out one particular demographic: Black men and boys. Black men and boys are often cast as the oppressor by factor of their maleness, and this analysis overlooks the historic systemic oppression Black men and boys have historically faced in America. So what I want to know is how we got here, and how did Black men and boys get pathologized in a theory that should validate their humanity? And to answer this question, the guest today is Professor Tommy J. Curry, PhD, MPH, Personal Chair of Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies, Department of Philosophy, the University of Edinburgh School of Philosophy, Psychology, and Language, editor of Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males by Temple University Press, editor of Decolonial Philosophy and Philosophy Compass, and the author of The Man Not: Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, winner of the 2018 American Book Award. Dr. Curry, how you doing today? Let's see if he can come through. Dr. Curry, unmute your mic.
Hey, sir. How are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you loud and clear. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
Thank you for taking time out of your schedule again to have this conversation. Um, let's get into it. Uh, I feel like the conversation about intersectionality is based in perception versus data, but I want to give everybody the data first. Black men are at or near the bottom of nearly every American socioeconomic metric. A 2018 study by Stanford, Harvard, and U.S. Census Bureau researchers concluded that Black men born to low income parents are much more likely to end up with a low individual income than Black women, and white men. A 2009 experiment conducted by Princeton University found that Black male job applicants were half as likely as white men to receive a callback, even if those white men had criminal convictions. Black men are criminalized at a rate sometimes 4 to 10 times higher, depending on the crime, than white males and some Black women. Black men who smoke weed are 4 times more likely to be arrested for possession. And then factor in low physical health outcomes, low mental health issues, and other issues that go ignored when it comes to the Black male populace. And my question for you is, if the goal of intersectionality is uplifting marginalized people, then why are straight or cis hetero Black men and boys absent from intersectional conversations?
Well, the reason for that is that intersectionality largely grows from an intellectual heritage of feminism. As we discussed a little bit last week, Kimberly Crenshaw really saw her intellectual genealogy as learning with second wave white feminists, people like Susan Schechter, people like Brown Miller, and of course, we know her association with Catherine McKinnon. Now, intersectionality comes on the back of the civil rights movement, meaning that while the struggles were fought in the 60s and 70s, intersectionality became a way to talk about anti discrimination law after the Civil Rights Act was passed. And what I find most interesting is that intersectionality really has two separate kinds of meanings. The first, of course, is political intersectionality. And these are the distinctions that Kimberly Crenshaw herself drew. So for her, she thought about political intersectionality was highlighted by the fact that women, black women specifically, are kind of between two subordinate groups, right? They're black and they're women. So that means that they're confronting and pursuing two conflicting political agendas. The other kind of intersectionality she talks about is a structural intersectionality, and this was what we discussed last week when we spoke a little bit about IPV, and intimate partner violence and homicide. She thinks that black women are differently situated in economic, social, and political worlds compared to black men. So she believes that the men are in fact gender privileged, while black women are going to be subordinated both on their race and their gender. Now, this presents several problems for us because she wants to read history in such a way that suggests that all Title VII legislation and the civil rights movement benefited men. But I think there's a few distinctions that we have to understand. First, in the 1960s, the arguments about Black manhood, Black masculinity, Black power presupposed the terms of its day. So while it's easy in the 1990s to look backward and say, well, look, these were patriarchal or male centered movements, during that period of time, the arguments about Black people's inferiority still presuppose the inferiority of Black men as the basis of all Black inferiority. Said differently, Black men's failures represented the entire failures of the race. The second point that differs is that whereas the 1960s and 70s saw the rise of Black power, and even, not only in terms of politics, but also in terms of academic movements like Black studies, intersectionality pursues a coalitional logic. Now, I want everyone to think about this really quickly. At the beginning of the book Black Power by Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton, they indicted the view. They did not agree with the notion that coalitions were in the best interest of Black people. Here's what they said. They said that during this period of time, there was a strongly held view in American society that the best and perhaps the only way for Black people to win their political and economic rights was to form coalitions with liberal, labor, church, and other kinds of sympathetic forces, including the liberal left wing of the Democratic Party. These groups of people, Black progressives, believed that this was the only way to solve the problem of racism in America. Not a pro Black movement, not a self determination movement. But Ture and Hamilton suggested that coalitions failed, and they gave three reasons. The first was that they assumed that what was good for America would necessarily be good for Black people. They suggested that this was a myth, that we cannot assume that what's good for America is good for Black people. The second thing they were concerned about was that you could have a viable coalition between two racial groups that are politically and economically insecure and one that is politically and economically secure. So whereas Black people didn't have any power or economic resources, how do you form a coalitional group where your interests are going to be taken care of when you're in a with a white group that has economic stability and enrichment and lots of political power, right? And the last is that he thought, well, look, we can't conduct business with whites who have historically been our oppressors purely on the basis of morality and appeals to their good conscience. Now, intersectionality under the Kimberly Crenshaw notions and Patricia Collins' work suggests that within a liberal democratic society, you can actually change white people's minds and get them to come along with your agendas. But I think you can see with the election of Trump what happens when white liberals are out of power. Now Black people have no one to respond to, no audience to appeal to. So now we're left in complete stagnation because we don't have an economic or political power base that was not dependent and enabled by whites.
How does that play out in the modern day, as you said, where if the whole idea of intersectionality is sort of like this flattening of everybody's oppression? How does that take away from things that black people try to do ever since from the 1960s up until the present day, where everything is sort of like in this sort of like in this mix of things where nothing really stands for anything and anything can stand for anything and then nothing really stands?
Well, well, it's a difficult question because I think we have a confusion about how to read history. So, Black male study scholars, for instance, discuss the Black male problem of intersectionality. which is this idea that rather than focusing purely on white supremacy and then what's caused by white supremacy, like poverty, like intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide, etc., that we can somehow splinter identities into multiple facets and then have causal properties associated with those facets. Here's what I mean by that. If you say that a black man is both black and male, you can say that he's oppressed because he's black, privileged because he's male, but the maleness is equatable to patriarchy, his want for power like traditional men. So in a world where racism doesn't allow him to be a traditional white man, he yearns for that and seeks to have that kind of power. So he compensates, right? This is what we talked about a little bit last week with criminology. And they adopt this as a way to explain things. What this allowed us to do is try to create hierarchies within groups. This means that instead of us focusing on the overall dynamics of social hierarchies, we then started focusing on how different identity groups and presumptions about the psychoanalytic drives of certain groups to want power or to be driven by violence or sexual aggression, like black men, were bigger threats to the daily lives of black people than were the overall structure of white supremacy. Now, this originates in a world where you have certain groups of Black people trying to assimilate within predominantly white institution and power structures. That didn't exist in the 1950s and 60s because legal segregation flatlined what we largely thought of as the differences of identity. Because if you were Black, you were already legally locked out, systematically barred from participating in white society and white higher ed institutions. But after desegregation and after the civil rights movement, you then began to have the opportunity to participate in these white institutions and get a certain kind of class privilege, political capital, etc. So the nuances that intersectionality claims to be beneficial to Black liberation were only beneficial to the extent that they were already recognized by white liberals as fitting within their goals of politics or within their goals for institutional reform. Now, I think something that's really important that a lot of people don't understand about the history of intersectionality is that while Kimberly Crenshaw introduced this idea from her interpretation of court cases, specifically the Graffenrin Reed and General Motors, uh, there's a difference between what she sees as Black women needing to be a protected class for justice and then how Title VII legislation was actually set up. Now, Title VII was a mechanism that was supposed to stop employment discrimination and give Black people the right to sue under this new law if they weren't hired. But as we know from the congressional record and the actual debates in Congress, not the interpretation of a specific case, but what Congress actually said, the real issue in Title VII legislation was between white women and Black women. White women in Congress were concerned that if a white woman and a black woman applied for the same job and they had equal qualifications, that the black woman would be given the job over the white woman because if the white person or the white employer did not hire the black woman, she would have the right to sue. Now, this was about integrating race into Title VII. And this is what's so important to contextualize the historical revisionism that I think Crenshaw builds her theory off of. Crenshaw suggests to us that Black men were the primary targets and beneficiaries of desegregation and integration. But when you look at the court with the actual debates in Congress, the fundamental classification around race presumed the Black female worker, and sex was added to Title VII so that white women had the right to sue. The fear was completely based on the fact that Black women would have rights to sue that white women didn't have. In fact, when you actually look at one of the letters they got in the amicus briefs by Emma Miller, she actually said that they were afraid to add race to Title VII jurisprudence because it would hurt white women's ability to actually be equal citizens in the United States. And you can't make this up. So forgive me. I just have to read this really quickly. She actually said that we are alarmed over the interpretation that may be given to the words discrimination on the account of race, color, religion, and national origin that is used in the Title VII bill. If the meaning of these words is not made clear in the bill itself, we are informed that in the past, some government officials have interpreted race, color, religion, and national origin in a way that has discriminated against the white, native born American woman of Christian religion. Now, the addition of sex that Kimberly Crenshaw talks about in Title VII jurisprudence, that she says that she believes is both formulates the political and the structural aspects of intersectionality, were based on a fundamental divestment that white women are interested in divesting the black race of the economic and educational benefits they gained from the civil rights movement. So white women were worried that if you didn't put sex in the Title VII and only put race, that they were going to be disadvantaged compared to the Negro. So at the end of the congressional debates, they said, well, if we add race, we know that one of the risks is to now focus on women. It would divert the resources from black people and give them all to white women. So when you look at the history of intersectionality, it is it is coveted as a progressive movement, right? That is about nuance and identity and understanding the relative position of people based on two subordinate identities. But the whole notion of sex being put in Title VII was about creating a category of woman that was thought to be a minority group and oppressed so that it could take resources from black people so it wouldn't disadvantage women in education and employment. So when we think about this theory and you ask yourself, why were white women the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action? Why did white women see such an increase in education and economic mobility after Title VII and black people saw virtually none? That's your answer.
From what you're telling me and looking at the research, it seems that there was a fear in the white liberal, especially the white liberal feminist woman, that black women and black people in general would eventually gain some sort of advantage over them, is what you're telling me. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. And you can see this throughout not only through the congressional debate, which is publicly available, but you can actually see this in some of the broadcasts and news releases that were done around this issue during the time. Right? Like people like Martha Griffith were very, very clear that they thought they had a win because they protected women. But people who were debating with her, like on CNN, for instance, said, well, what does this do to black people? And her argument, well, we help black women. You see, so the logic of intersectionality that made black women a special case of assimilation within certain white institutions was already settled. It certainly didn't help poor black women and it didn't help poor black men, but that wasn't necessarily the goal. You see, we've adopted a system that's created pretense about social inequality, where we've suggested that anyone who is born male, right, necessarily is patriarchal and has the psychology of masculinity that wants to conduct violence. This is easily shown within feminist arguments historically around debates around rape, but it's also shown in their arguments around domestic violence. So it does not become surprising that much of the terrain that intersectionality lays out in terms of the dangers that black women face are around rape and domestic violence. And we see today how this language is being utilized even by someone like Trump in Chicago, where he's justifying state intervention and probably martial law based on him claiming, right, that black women are asking him to intervene to protect them from the ills of the men or from the savagery of the men in their communities. Now, this logic is not very different than what we saw in the late 1800s with colonization. White feminism, the white woman's burden, so to speak, was always about the humanitarian efforts to save savage women from the violence and the barbarism of savage men. We saw this in the early 1900s, specifically when white women would go into black homes to try to teach them hygiene and how to be proper women, given poverty and given the number of single mother households. This is a reoccurring theme throughout history. Actually, my ex-student, Dr. Gilmore, has done a lot of research about how this is one of the major aspects of counterinsurgency that we see in various spheres of conflict around the world. My work is more interested in the social, political, and legal reconstruction of this problem. But as Black people, we can see how state intervention within Black families and the reproduction of the idea that Black men are dangerous and that it's progressive to save Black women, to educate Black women, to fund Black women only schools like Spelman because they're the future of the race. These ideas are not generated from Black people themselves. These are aspects of white supremacy that saw Black men as not being being able to be assimilated and black women better able to be assimilated within white institutions and proliferate or promulgate the values of a white liberal democratic society.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit further because, as you just laid out, a lot of this comes from the fear of white feminists and white women. How do you change this conversation, or how do you get a conversation that has an origin in the fear of white women being replaced, and get black feminists and get some black people on board with this to where they're propagating some of the same rhetoric, or if not worse? How does that happen?
Well, brother, we've always had black people that have believed the mythologies of white social mobility and elevation. Right. I mean, you have to understand that part of the basis of the civil rights movement was precisely on the terms by which the black middle class, or what Bowser's called the black petite bourgeoisie, for instance, people who were teachers, people who have had some form of higher education, could negotiate their place within this new configuration of white supremacy. And I think you can see now how vulnerable that kind of position is, given that you have a white conservative in office that's basically took apart the white liberal platform. And this is what's important. The reason that you have black people that believe that is because they had a buffer class of white liberals that were allowing them access into these institutions. So black people, like every other group of ethnic and racial group that came to America, started assimilating certain ideas that would allow them social and political mobility into the middle class and the upper classes. That's ultimately what happens. What the problem, however, is this racial class dynamic. The same theories that were utilized to explain compensatory masculinity. And remember, compensatory masculinity is the idea that because racism oppresses black men and they don't have economic and educational resources like white men, they compensate for that lack of social capital with violence. So those same kind of theories that were utilized to explain domestic violence or rates of homicide and rape were also utilized to separate black men from processes of integration within the larger society. So the black middle class could look at black people, and Elaine Brown writes a wonderful book on this called The Condemnation of Little B, where she says, listen, there is a class war that is going on between the black middle class and poor working class black men. This is the same argument that you see with people like Sylvia Winter in No Humans Involved, where she says that the black academic class has turned its back on urban black men who are victims of police brutality. Because ultimately, the black middle class that has power, economic mobility, and at least some semblance of white humanity is able to analyze poor black men and poor black people as somehow out of the sphere of their moral community. So there's always been incentives within any colonial endeavor, within imperialism, within apartheid, segregation, etc., for those people who are part of the oppressed class to try to assimilate and gain some sort of position within the institutions and the platforms of the oppressors.
All right, Dr. Curry, take me through the process to get these ideas out of the academy and into some of the spaces where you would not expect them to be. Like when you hear hateful rhetoric about black males coming from people who are ostensibly supposed to be advocates for black people in general, but how do black men get separated from the mass of people who are oppressed, and how does the rhetoric that's so hateful about them end up moving out of these academic spaces, out of these liberal spaces into public consciousness?
Well, I mean, there's a few things. I mean, we can understand very clearly that there's been a concerted effort to demonize black men and boys since the Haitian Revolution, right? We can go literally back to the 1800s on this issue. What we have had happen was a attempt to erase the specificity of black male oppression, to somehow replace that with notions of gender progress, where we've seen certain groups of women, and it's not just black women or black feminists, right? It's certain classes of black women and other oppressed racial female groups that are able to come into these institutions and gain position. So what the liberal academy does, and to be honest with you, this is the insight, or this is I don't want to say the insight. Well, this is what the conservatives recognize as well. Universities and colleges in America have an extremely liberal left reformist lean. Back in 2017, when I was attacked by the alt-right for saying that black people had a constitutional right to defend themselves, what I said was the reason that the alt-right and now the mainstream Republican Party are going after colleges and universities is not because of their ideological disagreements, it's because of the socializing effect that people have from going to colleges and universities through liberal arts. Now you have to remember the liberal arts curricula was designed, right? The core curriculum that we take in most colleges and universities here in the United States was designed after the civil rights movement. They changed it, and you can see this work in William V. Spano's. He has a great chapter on this in his book, The End of Education, where he talks about them reforming liberal arts curricula so that it had a disdain for black militancy, made people believe that everything could be happened through a democratic and deliberative process of discussing and arguing viewpoints, and that coalitions were the best mechanism of reform. So what colleges and universities did in the United States was they socialized new generations of students into a kind of liberal ideology, a liberal leftist ideology that did not believe in social revolt and had a fundamental fear of black male militancy. So when you follow, and Sylvia Wynter talks about this as well, right? When you follow the trajectory of how they tell history, how you tell the story of black militancy, that these were evil black men that were oppressing black women, where you talk about the failure of the movement because of their sexism, it reinvigorates notions of primitivity. So it's quite easy for people who have been socialized in this through their whole liberal arts curricula, which is why the people who advocate this are usually coming from fields like English, literary criticism, philosophy, women and gender studies, etc. Right? It becomes quite easy to control the sentiment that these people will have once they get out of college. Now look at what the conservatives did. They said, well, look, if we know that the liberal arts curricula is making people more democratic, even though they're still racist, they're not racist enough. So if we challenge what they teach at universities, no more DEI, no more critical race theory, no more feminism, no more intersectionality, we can now reclaim the conservative element of the young people so that they don't get brainwashed into liberal democratic class politics. And that's what we're witnessing today. We're witnessing the divestment of the institutions, universities, that are teaching and socializing people into the political left or to liberal ideology and replacing it with conservative viewpoints and talking points. This will fundamentally change the trajectory by which black people can interact with the white majority. So now that black people don't have a white liberal audience that's going to allow some of us to have access to government jobs, advanced grants, positions within the academy, because now white people are scared of losing their job, intersectionality's coalitional logics doesn't really apply because the white people are in their own self-interest. This goes back to what Ture said. The white liberals are fighting for their own preservation against another group of powerful whites. As Derek Bell said in Silent Covenants, this makes black people a disinterested third party. We will benefit or be disadvantaged based on what happens between the arbitration of the powerful white group on the right and powerful white groups on the left. We have no independent economic or political power to pull anybody out towards our direction or our interests within American society or within these institutions like the university.
That brings me to another point because I feel like what you just laid out ties into what it seems to be happening where a lot of academics are being very vocal about their fear of being replaced in the academy or losing their positions in the
Hmm.
academy. But some of these same academics are the same ones that have been propagating a lot of anti-black misandrous points about black men in general, or actively trying to freeze black academics, black male academics, and black male students out of the academy altogether. And now that this rude awakening is coming,
Yes.
now all of a sudden it's we're all black and let's all stick together. So my question is, now that this turn of events has come to pass, what can black people who are concerned about the education and the well-being of black male students and black people in general do to either correct these people or be able to move the curriculum if possible?
Well, I think there's two things to understand. Intellectuals usually reflect the bourgeois tenor of their times. This is why people like Zygmunt Bauman were constantly concerned with even how white academics dealt with what he called the new poor, or what Fanon would call the wretched of the earth. We can't depend on the sensibilities of liberal academics to concern themselves with the people they seek to exploit. Right? Like the position of many black people in the U.S. Academy is that they are thought to be the civilized representative and speaking and speaker for the savage poor. Right? You don't want black people, specifically black men, who have been locked up to speak to you about the prison industrial complex. You want the educated middle class black person that's suspicious of black masculinity to tell you how bad incarceration is. So you always have a proxy for that experience. White liberals don't want their hands dirty. They don't want their eyes stained by the curse of blackness. They want someone to interpret that reality for them. That being said, what we now see is a complete divestment in the kind of liberal racial reform that became common, during the 1980s and 90s. So we're going to see a collapse of that class of black intellectuals. What does that mean? Well, on the one hand, it means that theories like intersectionality, black feminism, liberal progressivism, the idea of democratic reform are now going to be thrown back on his heels as false ideas, or ideas that certainly don't have a lot of empirical weight behind them. It means that we get to reconsider many of these theories that have been sold to us by a kind of black bourgeoisie. But on the other hand, it puts us back to where we were during the Jim Crow era. Because now that black people are going to be systematically barred from assuming professorships, gaining admission as students into the U.S. Academy, you're going to deal with the further minoritization of this group, and they'll have even a smaller influence in the production of knowledge for their own people than they had before. So, I think of it this way. After the civil rights movement, with the birth of intersectionality and the rise of black liberals as the dominant voices of black culture and political theory, you had all these black people fighting for the crumbs that white people left them on the basis of identity and social position. And that battle lasted for 40 or 50 years. Now white people have taken away the damn table. And we have to reconfigure what it means now for black people to think as black and being affected and disenfranchised and divested of their opportunities of social mobility on the fact of their racial background and not their subsequent identities. Now, in terms of what we can do, that's a little different. Black communities have always been resilient. We've always had oral traditions. We've always had, processes by which we taught people within their own communities. I think that will now become more relevant yet again. I think the kind of bourgeois intellectualization we've seen with people embracing psychoanalysis as the primary lens to talk about the desires of various Black identities and Black groups is going to be a thing of the past. Because psychoanalysis is a speculative discourse around what people desire based on trying to reveal the unconscious. It has very little to do with how we understand behavior. It prioritizes desire and libidinal economies over material reality and political economy. And I don't think that that's going to be the language that the new generation that's facing militarism, a new Jim Crow in very real terms, and economic and political, marginalization across generations are going to speak in. I could, of course, be wrong, but I'd be really surprised because you don't usually find oppressed populations in real time responding through psychoanalytic discourse. It's much more revolutionary. It's much more political. It's much more economic, right? Because they're worried about the actual consequences of violence and the death toll that's taken on their people. So I think that for black men and boys, this becomes an opportunity to reconsider their relationship with many of these theories. But it also becomes incumbent on black communities to start re-socializing themselves now with a suspicion of the black academic class, but also with an eye towards how do you move and how do you mobilize and organize in a world without liberal funders, without liberal intervention, and with much fewer resources and a more militarized America than the 1960s and 70s.
All right, Dr. Curry, I want to take this out of the classroom for a second and move it into actual practice in activist spaces and political spaces. Um,
Hmm.
one of the main tenets of intersectional ideology as it's practiced is the idea that one should be elevated by effect of their identity and not necessarily by their ability. We've seen that in a lot of activist
Hmm.
movements. We've seen that even in academia to a point. And that's not saying that somebody's identity hinders them from being effective leaders, but it seems like your identity is the first priority, and whatever your capabilities are, your abilities are secondary to that in a lot of spaces. Why is
Hmm.
identity more of a selling point than ability?
Well, I think your empirical case there would be something like Black Lives Matter. And identity becomes kind of a representational, it becomes a signifier, it becomes a symbol of what one takes to be not only the authority as the most oppressed within intersectional logics, but also one's moral authority. You know, we've adopted this kind of perverse notion that suggests, based on intersectional logics, that the more subjugated identities you have, the more insights you have about oppression. This is why under BLM, for instance, you could have, black women who identified as non-binary or queer direct a movement, be assimilated within neoliberal structures, be sponsored, right, by McDonald's, Cadillac, etc., by $1 million homes, all off of the backs of dead, poor black men and boys. Uh, the society has adopted a way of articulating racial dissent and dissatisfaction based on moral speakers. And black men are not allowed to be moral speakers unless they have some sort of distance from the black community. So I think when you talk about people like Darren Seals and him being murdered, you have to ask a very simple question. If he wasn't considered the face of the movement, and the women who were the face of the movement got Nobel Peace Prizes, right, or some form of, recognition for their activism, why is the brother in St. Louis being killed and assassinated? You see, regardless of how we frame these issues, intersectionality is a reformist movement. And that's fine if you just admit that's what your theory does. But there's been no violent or militant revolution for civil rights in America since the 1960s with SNCC and with the Power movement and Black Panther Party. So when you see black men being shot and killed in the street, because let's be honest with the numbers, right? Black men are over 96% of the black people killed, right, by cops. So when you look at that kind of disparity, you would assume, based on intersectional standpoint theory, that black men were the ones that had the closest experience to the violence that they were experiencing. But that didn't apply to black men at the time. They suggested that you needed an intersectional feminist leadership. And what happened? It was co opted, it was manipulated, it was enriched at the expense of practically all the poor working class black men and women that either had lost their sons or daughters or were in a position not to negotiate directly with the Democratic National Party. We have to be more attentive to how political organizations and theories interact. Again, what has happened is that through education and generations of the idea that we had made progress before Trump, we had been socialized to believe almost intuitively, right? So we start with the intuition that black women are more oppressed, black women should be political leaders, etc. Now that doesn't bar a black woman from being a political leader, but it doesn't mean that the middle class black woman who's educated at Howard or Harvard should be the voice of a whole people. You're not putting forward people like Asada. You're not putting forward people like my grandmother who was a house cleaner for white people. You don't care about those black women. And you don't care about those black men either. You just don't see them as being the voice of a movement because that's not what you see as being represented on MSNBC and having tea with Hillary Clinton over her Tabasco hot sauce in a purse, right? We've adopted a representational model of black politics that we see time after time continues to fail us, and we assert that certain people who are more akin to the Democratic Party and more akin to liberal politics and reformism would be the best leaders for black people when the world keeps showing us, so to speak, that there's not really a moral universe or conscience, right, that we can appeal to when we're dealing with our white oppressors. So we have to change how we think. And these activist spaces are so dangerous because they're pseudo academic. Right? It's like you put bell hooks in their hand or you put, the Black Lives Matter anthology in their hand and that becomes their creed. There's no dialectic, there's no debate about ideas anymore. So black people don't have a back and forth about what's the best thing. What you now have is a religious ideology that if you're not intersectional, you're sexist, misogynistic, patriarchy, or patriarchal, right? If you're not for Kamala, you're for Trump. Even if you want to disengage politics because of, say, the position on imperialism and genocide, right? We've made black politics a moral, epitaph, right? Rather than actually being able to talk about what are the different ideas and arguments that would best suit black people as a whole, or even black people in terms of different sex. It may be the case that black men don't have the same agenda as many black women in America, given the levels of incarceration, murder, and police violence that we experience. And now, right, given what Trump's done with black women in employment, you see their numbers slowly approaching black men's because he let loose over 300,000 black women from government jobs. So now we have a new something to renegotiate. Now it's a different issue. Now, now they're not going to be marrying down. Right now, we're not going to have economic division masking itself as a gender division. Right. This is going to reformulate a lot of the discussion we've been having over the last decade or so. And to be honest with you, I don't actually think that we're ready for that realization because we don't have the kind of unity and we don't have a culture of dialogue where black people can speak to one another without morally condemning each other.
I'm actually glad you brought that up. And before we move on to the next part of the conversation, I want to do a little house cleaning. Thank you for coming into the space. This is the Black Male Study Session, Episode 2, Intersectional Failure. Again, this series is sponsored by the African Americans Men's Historical Society. If you want to learn more about the AMHIS, go to amhis.org and visit their Substack at amhis.substack.com. I want to give everybody some numbers before we move on. This is data from mappingpoliceviolence.org and the Washington Post Fatal Force Database. Between 2014 and 2020, 1,681 Black people were killed in police encounters. 1,604 of those were Black men. 77 of those were Black women. This to give everybody some information before we move forward, because what I want to talk about now, you just touched on it, Dr. Curry, is this sort of weaponization of the language of quote unquote liberation or the language of Black politics, Black centered politics. A common
Hmm.
tool of this group and a common tool of a lot of people is what I call anti-Black misandry, but it's camouflaged in liberation terminology. This is done by the use of loaded language and something called thought terminating cliches. Thought terminating cliches are phrases used to end debate or deflect questioning by using deflection and ad hominems. For example, the term "none of us are free until all of us are free," or what you see a lot online, the idea of just say you hate Black women and go if you criticize one individual Black woman in response to any challenge. And all too often, this language is used to shut down people who question anybody who's a prominent activist or a prominent academic who claims to align themselves with ostensibly Black movements while they can still make anti-Black misandrous comments. Can you explain how the language of liberation gets co-opted to ensure that Black men and boys stay ignored, marginalized, and oppressed?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is what I study. Um, Let me begin by saying that I think that this goes to the point of moral condemnation, where we've been socialized not only as academics, but really just people who have attended college, right? The educated or the middle class aspirant Black person to reject certain ideas. And this goes back to what, Sylvia Winter and William V. Spanos were saying that, look, if you educate people to fear certain aspects of liberation movements, like the Black Panther Party, for instance, the product of that is going to be that any Black political movement that's associated or reminds or even, reminisces or memorializes those Black political movements are guilty by association. Many of the terms that you just announced, like we're not free till we're all free. I always laugh when I hear that because I really want people to think about this seriously. We are telling oppressed Black people that if you don't solve all the issues of oppression, capitalism, sexism and patriarchy, racism, colorism, etc., nobody is free. But then you look at the class that has freedom, namely the white oppressors, and their culture and society is full of patriarchy, capitalism, racism, genocide, right, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm always interested as to how Black people who have no power see themselves as failing or succeeding on the basis of their political morality rather than understanding the ways that certain institutions, infrastructures, and nations are fundamentally built on violence. And I think that many academics will reply and say, oh, we get that. We just don't believe we should imitate the oppressor. And I'm fine with that. But then you want to be a class that speaks to the oppressor about their oppression. Both can't be true. You can't think that you're possibly more moral just because you have audience with your oppressor, and then condemn people who are trying to work through systems like working class Black people who may not share your politics. When you don't have power, you find the most asinine things to divide yourselves with. White people have historically been the most corrupt and violent people on the face of the earth. Histories of genocide, indigenous genocide, settler colonialism, imperialism, etc., enslavement prove that without it beyond a shadow of the doubt. Yet, everything that we do is based in our comportment of making our politics reflect their interests. So, Black militants don't have any public platform because white liberals only wanted to hear from other Black liberals and Black feminists. Those are the people who are our pundits. Those are the people who were covering the election results with when Kamala lost to Trump. Those are the people that largely decide how Black people are going to be interpreted to the rest of the world. So, in a world where people are still facilitating this narrative that Black men are bad, they're doing so because it fundamentally agrees with the white people in power. And we have to be honest. We have an almost exhausting amount of data that shows us that most of the employment discrimination and social discrimination aligns itself with the perceptions that white people have of Black men being dangerous, being animals like apes, are fundamentally not being human at all. Despite that evidence, you also have a class of Black academics, both men and women, who say you're absolutely right. Black men are that dangerous. They are misogynistic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the people, the Black people that are allowed to have power within these organizations and institutions are doing the same thing the white people are doing. They're claiming under a liberation language to try to make the community safer by getting rid of these savage and barbaric and violent Black men, but they never take stock of whether or not violence in the community actually changes. So when you think about issues of rape or domestic violence or crime or deviance or drug use, you can lock up as many Black men as you want. The crime is in those communities don't necessarily decrease. In fact, what we've seen under Black male leadership in Chicago and places like Baltimore is that the same things I'm constantly talking about, like employment, education, community and neighborhood reform, mental health, those things decrease crime. Why? Because crime is an expression of disorder or lack of order and normalization within respective communities. Deviance doesn't happen because you're a Black man. It doesn't happen just because you're poor. It happens because being poor means that you can't satisfy basic needs, that you're in constant disequilibrium with your environment. So why do middle class people have less deviant crimes? Well, or like robbery, murder, etc. It's because most of their needs are satisfied. Doesn't mean they're good people. It just means that they don't have a need to act out to try to steal or accumulate resources within amidst scarcity. And it's these misunderstandings, right? And I'm saying misunderstandings because what you have are groups of people that are able to utilize racial deviance, right? Like Black people's disproportionate rates of crime or domestic violence or child abuse, whatever the case may be, and sell that to white liberals as them needing to culturally intervene into the Black community and Black race. Whereas anyone who actually studies these issues would say, well, look, you put any group of people, Black, white, brown, yellow, it doesn't matter, in the same conditions, you get the same result. So instead of dealing with the political economy and the material conditions that give rise to these kinds of issues like domestic violence, drug abuse, depression, suicide, etc., you say no. We need to culturally readjust Black people, and this is the insidiousness of the liberal. The liberal says everyone should have access to the goods of a democratic society with the caveat that you have to be a rational, moral individual. Well, black people are historically thought not to be moral and rational. Then the black liberal, the black feminist, the black intersectional theorist says, hey, we admit, we agree with you. The black community is broken. It's sexist, it's misogynistic, it's homophobic. So let's go correct these black men because evidently, only black men and boys are the problem. And that's why you get the kind of neglect that you find. You deal with them through incarceration. You deal with them through ostracization, making sure they don't lead political parties. And you lift up a certain group of black intellectuals, both men and women, right, who are able to kind of promulgate the ideas of the white liberal ideology and the Democratic Party. We saw this in Black Lives Matter. We saw this in really, I think, My Brother's Keeper was a really, really good example of this because what you found was Barack Obama saying, "Hey, black men need role models." Right? He has this kind of deficit model thinking around black men and boys, right? That they're lazy, they're unmotivated, that external oppression of black men doesn't affect, their life prospects or aspirations. So right, they need role models, they need funding to catch up to their female counterpart. And then what did you have? You had the black feminists, the black female liberal say, no, that money should go to black women because black women are not advantaged. And the issue wasn't black women being advantaged. The issue was that you're doing better in high school matriculation than black boys. Like that's just the fact. But even within that system, black men couldn't even get equality. Black feminists were resistant to programs that would bring black men into equality. So the question of liberation, which is what we started with, right? The question of liberation and whether or not we can all be free, right? Or just say you hate black women, is that black men are not able to criticize the specific programs and the specific discourses that are demonizing them. Because the people in charge of those discourses, which are actually white liberals, have empowered their proxies to manage black men so that no black male discord can disrupt the political system. Because think about it. If black men were in charge, or black men were dictating in terms of how the Democratic Party was seen, well, we know that black men, by and large, while they vote Democratic, don't support many of the policies of the Democratic Party because it doesn't benefit them. So what we have is a world in America where tell black men you should sacrifice for the liberation and betterment of other people who are not black males because that's what it means to be a progressive, liberal, black male political entity. And what we see with Trump is we see that that's exposed as a lie. The real people with power are white liberals. Black people are just proxies of white liberal power. And now that white liberals don't have power, black people don't have power. And that's the scam. That's why I think someone like Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton were so important because they reminded us that by putting your economic and political future in the hands of white liberals in the Democratic Party, remember they wrote this in 1967, you inevitably put yourself in a codependent relationship where when they fail, you fail. And what's happened now over the last 8 months is that we've seen the collapse of black economic and political prosperity purely on the basis that white people have said so, purely on the basis that Trump decided that the last 50 years of black civil rights movements no longer matter. And black men become the whipping boy for why Kamala Harris didn't win. They become the whipping boy for why we can't make progress as a race. They become the whipping boy for why we don't have a political entity. Well, you said that black men didn't need to say anything. You said that black male disdain and unemployment and unhappiness with the Democratic Party was why Kamala didn't get elected. Now that she's not elected, you need resistance. And inevitably, if America keeps going the way it's going, we're going to have to start talking about actual self-defense, right? And political mobilization for self-defense. Well, you're going to need men to do that. Why? Because when people have battles and wars are fought, men are the ones that are on the front lines. You see, time changes, politics change, history changes. And the mistake that I think intersectional theorists and many of these liberal academics make is they assume that their reign or their power will last forever. And that's the whole point of like a critical race theorist or even a black political pessimist. They understand that politics is not a universal sentiment. It changes with the dynamics of the economy and overall white sentiment and white population growth. So in 2017, when I was saying, listen, there's this fear in the alt-right that white people are becoming a minority. Look, they're creating a political sentiment around I think they call it stealthing, right? Basically raping white women, taking off condoms during consensual sex to increase the number of babies. I was like, this is literally what the conversation was in the 1800s at the turn of the 20th century. Like time is cyclical, right? The population demands of a group of people are going to reassert themselves, and white people have the disproportionate amount of power in government and the economy. So what do we see? They're reasserting that power to make sure that their racial group lives and ours doesn't thrive, right? It's the rule of Western societies. But we keep pretending that we're exceptions to that we're exempt from this process of what we know about societal development and social hierarchy. And that's always to our detriment. And listen, in 10 years, this will pass. It'll become normalized. We'll talk about how bad we have it, but some black people will adjust. They'll become more moderate in their political stance to mediate the political and institutional climate of America. You'll still have working class black people being shafted that will still be the most radical in the society. But because of their high levels of criminality, because of higher levels of incarceration, people won't listen to them. They won't become representative. Then something will happen that will change in the mid 21st century after many of us are dead and gone, and then the cycle will repeat. It's rinse and repeat. This is what happens. This is what happens all over the world. The problem is black people try to moralize political liberation instead of understanding how we codify it within certain kinds of national institutions and policy. We our privileges, our human rights, our civil rights are far too contingent on the opinions of white people to actually be taken seriously as any form of progress.
All right. I want to move the conversation into another subject tied into what we've been talking about already. I want to get into what I want to call pop culture and political burnout. The modern reawakening of the world to the plight of black men and boys began, in my opinion, with the killing of Trayvon Martin. It reached critical mass after the killing of Mike Brown, and the murder of George Floyd was the explosion that ignited global outrage and worldwide protests against state sanctioned violence perpetrated against black men. You mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement earlier, and the Black Lives Matter organization became, or it was allowed to become, the lead organization guiding this outrage. And under that stewardship, the concepts of intersectionality we just talked about began to overtake the primary reason why the world was outraged. State sanctioned violence against black men and boys took a backseat to sexual orientation and gender identity. Black fists began to be joined and connected to rainbow flags. Conversations about feminism took center stage, and an individual's identity became more important than an individual's ability to lead, with the result being the movement basically becoming a parody of itself. You saw people shouting in the
Mhm.
microphones. You saw people twerking on riot cops. You saw people dancing in line dances, people painting murals in the street. And then corporate mass media adapted the movement as it always does to sell products like, who's it, Kylie or Kendall Jenner's Pepsi ad. The political response was even worse than the social response, with more optics and gestures, like Nancy Pelosi and other leading Democrats wearing kente cloth and kneeling like Colin Kaepernick. Ultimately, all that outrage and all that goodwill was squandered to the point that the backlash, I think, against wokeness is just as much a backlash against that shrillness and that mission creep and that parody as it is against the demand for black equity. So, what responsibility do intersectional organizations have for taking the urgency and the momentum out of that era and this current political climate?
Well, I mean, I think they have a lot of responsibility. Um, they were the ones negotiating directly with the Democratic Party. Uh, and to be honest, I mean, that AAFP paper that Kimberly Crenshaw's organization wrote around police violence, I think is a prime example of that, because what they were able to do was to shift the movement from, right, black men and boys being killed by police, right, to agendas for sexual minorities. And instead of putting this stuff together, this is why I always say, right, this is why data is important. No one is denying that all black people, men, women, right, queer populations, trans populations, etc., are disproportionately affected by police violence compared to other groups. But what seems to happen when we have these conversations is that we're put into a position where only a certain number of people can go through. There was a study that was actually done, looking at minority participation. I wrote about it in an article. He never made it. He never mattered. Where they showed that the more that Black Lives Matter and Black civil rights organizations supported Black men's vulnerability and their victimization to violence, the less support they got from white liberals. So I can't help but think that given the strategies that intersectional organizations like the AAFP took towards the issue of police brutality and police violence, that chose to center women and sexual minorities, that was a conscious decision to gain audience with powerful white liberal interest groups. So when we talk about the responsibility then for the failure of those movements to materially change lower class and working class black communities that are heavily policed and are the primary victims of that kind of violence, I think they showed a large amount of that responsibility because they not only took the attention away, they didn't fight for the inclusion of working class black men and women who were being surveyed, who were surveilled, who were being killed, who were being harassed, right? They didn't see the poor black community or the working class black community as being fundamentally intertwined with mechanisms of control and surveillance. That was not their primary occupation. They were more concerned with whether or not there were going to be reforms and candidates launched, right? And this is the important part about Kamala, candidates launched that represented their political interests. But Kamala was a cop, right? Black men and black women didn't believe that Kamala was the best candidate for their interests. So when intersectionality has the power to frame a representation, and I'm not trying to blame this purely on Kimberly Crenshaw or Patricia Collins. What I mean is when you take the ideology of intersectionality and it's embraced through pundits like Reed, like Joy Reid, right? Or it's embraced on MSNBC as the talking points of Rachel Maddow, or there's a primary assumption that black women are the most progressive simply because they vote Democrat towards the Democratic Party the most. You've already empowered a certain kind of narrative that said the default of any black party or black people is going to be for the Democrats, regardless of what they do. Now, by no means will I ever suggest that black people vote right, but if you're going to vote for the left or the liberals or the Democrats, whatever we want to call them, and you get nothing for it, especially the decrease in police violence that we saw or paid attention to under the presidency of Obama. You have to ask yourself, what are you casting your vote for? And inevitably, what the argument is going to be is many people supporting Kamala cast their vote for what they thought was the most moral and progressive choice, which was to see a black woman or a woman of color become president. But that representational model didn't do anything for us with Obama. Why would it do anything for us now? Right? Black communities are still suffering. Black communities are still being black men and boys in communities are still being killed. They're still being discriminated against. They still have the highest rates of social downward mobility or economic downward mobility. Right? All these problems are not solved when you look at the political cascade of ideas that have been thrust upon the black community. So I think intersectional ideology has a large responsibility to bear for the failure of black political empowerment, and certainly this is say its inability to stop police violence against black men and boys because it did not make that its primary function. It was more interested in representational politics. I mean, look at how many black people got Guggenheims and MacArthurs during Black Lives Matter. Look whose ideas were pitched as the basis of solidifying black political theory in the years to come. Those very same people who were arguing for liberalism, feminism, intersectionality, coalitional politics, why can their thoughts not subsist anymore? Why can their thoughts not sustain our liberation under Trump? Right, because it was conditional. It assumed a world that was run by white, liberal, privileged interests and reformism, not a world that was trying to reinstitute Jim Crow segregation.
All right. Let's get into the final question of the conversation. Solutions. You talked about some earlier, but let's lay out some ground rules on what that looks like. How do we fix this? And also, if you have time, we might do a brief Q&A if you have time, and I'll take two or three
Yeah,
questions.
that's fine. That's fine.
Okay, cool. So at the end of this, we'll get into a brief Q&A. So if you want to speak to Dr. Kerr, you have a question, put your hand up so I can see you, and then I'll let you come in. So how do we fix this, Dr. Kerr? Is it fixable?
I don't think it's fixable. My research suggests that it's not. there's the delusion that human action often translates into reform, resistance, and a kind of predictable course of action. You know, before Derek Bell died, he sent me this letter where he said that he no longer believed in his ability to predict what would solve or work, that it was all by chance, you know. So in my book, I have this whole chapter on Derek Bell and his notion of chance, which I think he gets from Du Bois. But look, man, you know, our political actions do not dictate how human history will transform. The things that transform history are usually the product of some large scale collapse, be it economic, political, or like a foreign invasion. Um, and what I think academics do is they often turn away from the evidence, right? The empirical force of history and economics, et cetera, and offer people ideal solutions when they really have none. This society is on the brink of collapse. What does that mean? That means a whole lot of white people are going to get sick. A whole lot of white people who are hoping that their notions of white supremacy create a buffer for them compared to the suffering of other black and brown populations will be disappointed when it does not. And that can cause a collapse of the civil society. But at the same time, you have lots of white people and privileged racial groups, right, that support what Trump's doing. They want to see this kind of authoritarianism. They would not be afraid of claiming or reinstituting or advancing the idea that Trump is in fact a monarch and that we should not no longer have kind of a representative republic or representative democratic system or society. Given that, you know, it's an open field. You know, there is not a solution to the ongoing socialization of white people to want to reassert their dominance and racial superiority over black people. At the end of the day, you have two or three options. You can fight back, which means that a lot of black people will have to lose not only their standard of living, but maybe their lives, right? You can leave, right? I said that this America was permanently racist. I had no problems with that view. That's what my research showed. So I left the United States. I was perfectly fine with that position then, and I'm even more fine with it now. Or you can try to adapt and live and accommodate these repressive times for a couple of generations until you have the opportunity to change it. Either way, we now know without a questionable doubt what the United States is. It is up to black people to decide how they're going to fight back. We know some strategies, but it all leads to open conflict. And I know people don't like that answer, but there's not a counterexample throughout history. Listen, what we have done, black people, because we've been oppressed in this country, we have learned to accept the murder of our people as a condition for some of us having comfortable lives. So when Trayvon Martin, when Mike Brown, when all those black boys were killed just for walking across the street, we said it's terrible, but we understand that that's the cost we have to pay in America for some of us to live well. Well, any genocide scholar will tell you that how they treat the men of the out group determines what's coming for the rest of the group. Intersectional feminists and black liberals did not think that rule of war and conflict applied to them. So after almost a decade of them systematically killing, incarcerating, and dehumanizing black men and boys, you now saw a president that came in with a set of actions that empowered states and the federal government to do the same thing to black people as a whole. These are patterns. There are certain repetitions that we can see from modernity forward that tell us about our oppression. The only way that those patterns have been interrupted have been through outright violence or the collapse of the society or certain groups of people moving from the society itself. And I know that's not the ideas that people like to hear, but we have sustained ourselves on the basis of 50 years of a civil rights movement that was a lie. We have told ourselves, we have lived in the fantasy that because we had black people die in March in the 1960s, and we had black people arm themselves in the 1970s, that our lives would fundamentally be better and our human and civil rights would be protected. And that 50-year lie was overturned within 3 months of Trump being in office. We have to think of new ways to engage the United States. And perhaps someone else may have a better solution. I'm all ears. But I'm a historical thinker. So I'm out of ideas for when you have a deliberately incurring reign of white supremacy and ethno-nationalism that is not sustaining itself politically, but is being legislated in Congress and then upheld by the Supreme Court. We have a very different struggle coming within the 20 in the rest of the 21st and the 22nd century, and we have to get our heads around what it's going to take to deal with that. So that may be going to back to Africa, it may be going to the Caribbean, it may be forming militarized sects here to protect our life and our property. Who knows? But what I will say is this: when we look at every other country in the world, right, we see the ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people right now. Throughout history, we have seen that certain people are eliminated from the face of the earth. And what I found to be the most disappointing aspect of my time as a scholar in the United States is that while we saw civil wars in Egypt and Africa, and now we see it in Gaza, in Palestine, nobody thought that could happen to us. We're 3 or 4 generations removed from enslavement. We're a couple of decades removed from South African apartheid. We've seen black people being lynched and hung from trees within the lifetime of my parents. And we see them being killed and lynched by police in our lifetime. I'm only 45 years old. What on God's green earth did we believe would happen to people who were racially oppressed? We disassociated the reality of oppression from what we saw as a few representative black people making it because they were entertainers or celebrities. And now that we're hit with this reality, it's incumbent on us not to mess it up in this next generation. So we will survive, we will find resilience, but the path towards that is going to be the same path we took 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's not going to be that we just elect a new president. We now see that the cultural seed of hatred, dehumanization, and anti-blackness is a very real and permanent aspect of American society. And that's not something that you just solve because we don't control the minds, the lives, or the political mechanisms of white people.
Dr. Curry, I think that's where we'll put a pin in it for today. Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. I know you're busy to be able to come in and have this conversation. Thank you for your insight. And also want to thank everybody who came through to listen to the second episode of the Black Male Study Sessions. I really appreciate each and every one of y'all taking time out of your day because I know you could be doing a bunch of other things in the middle of your day. So I appreciate you being here. Again, my name is Torraine Walker. If you are more interested in Dr. Curry's work, he's readily available. You can also pick up a copy of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood. And before we get out of here, can you tell people what you're working on, Dr. Curry? What you got coming up next?
Oh man, I'm working on the sequel to The Man Not. I'm working on a treatise on Black political theory in the United States that's based on facts of our dehumanization and not the ideology of liberalism. And of course trying to finish a book that's an introduction to Black male studies for polity. So I got a few projects on the burner.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. And again, thanks to everybody who came through. This has been the Black Male Study Sessions, Episode 2, Intersectional Failure. If you want to hear the playback, we'll have that up for you in about another hour. And also, this will be going up on YouTube. So I'll put the links up so people can check that out as well. So thanks to everybody who came through. Thanks again to Dr. Curry. Y'all have a good rest of your afternoon and enjoy your Labor Day if you're going to take it.